He is the author of a new book, Right Thing, Right Now, Good Values, Good Character, Good Deeds. He is a New York Times bestselling author, and he is Ryan Holiday here on The Will Cain Show. What's up, Ryan?
Not much. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. Glad to have a fellow Texan. I think you might be a Texan by choice. That's fine. So is Davy Crockett. But you got here as fast as you could. Fellow Texan. And, I would never be so bold as to proclaim myself a Stoic. But, Ryan, I've been fascinated by this for a while now into my adult life. And I think that my first fascination actually came through the form of fiction. It was a Tom Wolfe book, A Man in Full. And one of his main characters was a Stoic who was in prison. And it was something attractive about that character and the way he approached adversity and challenge in life that I began to get a little more interested. But I think we need to start with this. We need to not take for granted that anybody actually knows what Stoicism is, even though it's been around for thousands and thousands of years. So can you start with that? Like, what is Stoicism?
Yeah, I think people know the word stoic, which they think means emotionlessness or robotic or invulnerable. And maybe they don't even know there's this whole ancient philosophy built around that idea. Stoa means porch in ancient Greek. It's originated on a porch in the Athenian Agora by this guy named Zeno in the 4th century BC. But it becomes a philosophy not in the academic sense, but in the practical sense. So the Stoic philosophers were people who did things in the real world. You have a slave like Epictetus, who's a Stoic philosopher. Then you have Marcus Aurelius, who's the emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the world. And they're all practicing this philosophy built around this idea that we don't control what happens, but we control how we respond to what happens. And that everything we face in life is this opportunity to practice virtue, which for them was courage and self-discipline and justice and wisdom.
So 4 main virtues. You laid that out, by the way, in the introduction to your new book, Right Thing, Right Now. Let's go over those one more time. What are the 4 virtues of Stoicism?
Yeah, Stoicism and Christianity have the same cardinal virtues. Cardinal, as C.S. Lewis explains, doesn't have any religious connotation. It means it comes from the Latin cardos, or hinge. But the hinge virtues of Stoicism, as well as Christianity, are courage, self-discipline or temperance, justice, and wisdom.
Yeah, and the new book that you've written now is focusing on the concept of justice. But before we kind of go into this and we talk about the role specifically of justice as a virtue, I want to try to understand you. Like, what brought you to Stoicism? It's popular now, and you've helped make it popular. But, I mean, I think you're in your 30s. I'm in my 40s. We all, as you pointed out, know the word stoic as sort of an adjective. But we perhaps learned in school a little bit in Philosophy 101 about Stoicism as well. But I don't think it had ever arrived at a greatest hits or a popular movement. But it is really gaining popularity now. Yeah. Probably not when you picked it up. So how did you get to Stoicism?
Yeah, I was introduced to it while I was in college. I wasn't studying it in school. Someone just recommended this book. They said, hey, you should read this book. And I read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, the private thoughts of the most powerful man in the world. And what so struck me about that book was here was philosophy as a way of life. Here was philosophy that someone was applying to their job, as opposed to philosophy as a job in the way that a university professor would be a philosopher. And so this idea of philosophy being something very practical, being something very applicable, was very exciting to me. And then also the idea that it's this 1,000-year tradition. I mean, one of the first things Marcus Aurelius does in Meditations is he thanks his philosophy teacher for lending him the works of Epictetus, the philosopher that changed his life. And so this idea that for thousands of years, people have been saying, hey, you should read this. It works. This will help you with the problem that you're facing. This will help you with the grief that you're trying to get over. This will help you make sense of a world that's chaotic and overwhelming. That's what's been happening for a very long time. And it's kind of mind-blowing to think, Stoicism was ancient philosophy to Marcus Aurelius, too. It had been around for hundreds of years. It was as distant to him as Shakespeare is to us. So it's a very long tradition of practical, resilient people who are trying to make their way in the world, turning to these ideas and then putting their own spin on them in each generation. And I feel like that's even this conversation we're having now is just a continuation of what they call the great conversation. We're doing what people have been doing with the classical thinkers for as long as they've existed.
I think, and the key word you use there is practicality. I think that's what appealed to me as well. It's also virtue, and I want to come back to this idea of virtue and dive into justice. We will, but practicality is key to this because philosophy for so many can feel so abstract in an act of navel gazing. But there was something inherently practical about Stoicism in how you could actually make your life better starting every morning and how you approach everything. And I think because of that, it's a little bit like the ancient self-help guide. Everything is built upon that going forward. But you bring up that the four virtues are the same, not just of Christianity, but most Western religions, Abrahamic religions. And so I think that for some people, like Buddhism, and I know you're a fan, I think, of Buddhism, and there is a commonality to all of these religions. But help me reconcile this. I think for some, they see a competition as well between some of these philosophies and their other North Star, which is their religious belief. Probably for most listening, that would be, not all, but probably for most listening, that would be Christianity.
Yeah, look, certainly in the ancient world, they saw some competition between these two things. There was persecution going in both directions. But, St. Paul studies Stoicism. There are interactions between the Stoics and the Christians. There's even a series that they believe that the letters are fake now. But there was, in the ancient world, an attempt to link the Stoics and the Christians between a series of letters between Seneca and St. Peter. Seneca's brother is actually in the Bible. Gallo is in the Bible. His brother changes his name when he's adopted. But the idea of Stoicism being incompatible with religion, I don't think is true at all. To me, they can either complement each other or you can choose whichever one you want. The idea is, how do you live in such a way that you are fulfilling your potential as a human being and fulfilling your obligations to your fellow human beings? I think of Stoicism, one of the definitions Marcus Aurelius gives us. He says, the fruit of this life is good character and acts for the common good. That was his definition of a Stoic. I don't think that's a bad definition of a Christian either.
No, and I think not just fulfilling a good life for yourself and for your neighbor, but mostly compatible as well with fulfilling a good life for God. I mean, it is interesting that all of these virtues, it says something about humanity, and it perhaps says something about ultimate truth, that these virtues are present, whether or not it's Stoicism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Judaism, or Christianity.
Yeah, we notice this in evolution. There are different animals spread out all over the world that don't really share a common ancestor that can do the same thing. Birds and bats can both fly, right? Different animals have opposable thumbs. They evolved differently to solve some fundamental problem of reality. And I think this is true of the philosophical traditions. So in the Eastern world and the Western world, they're still dealing with the fact that most of what happens is outside of our control. They're still struggling with the fact that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. And so as they're dealing with the fact that we're all mortal and will die, the fact that people can be frustrating and annoying, the fact that we have conflicting desires, we have a way of thinking short-term and long-term. The idea, I think, philosophically, is that they're all trying to solve for some of the fundamental problems as well as opportunities of the human condition. And they come ultimately to very similar ideas. And to me, that lends credence to them, certainly.
Let's go back to you for a minute. So I want to talk to you about your rise to stardom here. So you discover Stoicism as a college student, but you did a lot of different things in life. You wrote actually a lot of different kinds of books. You worked in marketing, you talked about media. And then it seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, your big breakthrough is The Obstacle is the Way. It's your first book on Stoicism, and it's been a book that, just to help the audience understand, numerous professional athletes have pointed to as important in their personal development. The New England Patriots, Ryan Shazier, who was paralyzed, the Pittsburgh Steelers linebacker, Rory McIlroy, one of the greatest golfers in the world today, have all pointed to the obstacle is the way. So how did this happen for you? Like, you look up now and you're a multiple-time New York Times bestseller, and you're also huge on social media and YouTube. Like, got to be a little surprised that your devotion to Stoicism turned into stardom.
A little surprised is an understatement. When I went to my publisher in 2012 and I said, "Hey, I know I've just done these marketing books, but for my next project, I want to write about an obscure school of ancient philosophy," they were not excited. And although I was really passionate about it, I thought it was important. The idea that it would make its way into professional sports and politics and the armed forces, that world leaders would read it. This was an absurd pipe dream. It wasn't what I was thinking about at all. I just knew that these ideas had worked for me and they'd worked historically. And I wanted to bring them into a new context and make them more accessible. Stoicism has lasted for 20 plus centuries for a good reason. And it is understandable. It's easy to communicate. We just have some new tools that, the ancient Stoics wouldn't have had access to, even a podcast like this or watching on YouTube or social media. These are new ways of getting the ideas out. And I feel lucky to have been able to sort of talk to a large audience through them. But ultimately, I understand this is the ideas and not me that's doing the lifting here.
Well, you also met a moment and you met a demand, you met a need. And this isn't going to be so much of a question, but I'm just going to give you a few thoughts of mine as to what might have happened. I'm curious what you'll agree with or disagree with. But, and this is not obviously an endorsement, this is a for better or worse situation. Every public polling shows that religion has been on the decline in America for quite some time now, decades. I do believe, Ryan, that we are inherently religious creatures. What I mean by that is we need to find something to place, some place to place our faith. And if we take faith out of our sense of purpose and our reason for being, we don't just exercise it away from our lives. It's like a balloon that you squeeze and we find new places to apply it. And I think for many that has become politics. It's become an article of faith, politics. I think COVID became a real example of people sort of repeating mantras as follow the science and almost a religious fervor. I think a lot of things have shown that we will apply faith. We'll find a place. And if we strip religion out of it, we'll find other places to give our devotion. And maybe Stoicism as a movement is benefiting from that, as people looking for other places to find those virtues. Also, I would add to it this, Ryan, we're at a moment in time where people feel a bit powerless, and I think COVID, again, was a real inflection point on that, where it's like, oh my gosh, I don't have control over so many things in my life, and I can feel the control being stripped away. And Stoicism, an answer to that, as you pointed out earlier, it's like you can't control what happens to you, but can control how you react. And for me, that all created an environment ripe for Ryan Holiday and Stoicism.
I think that's the environment that people have always turned to Stoicism. Marcus Aurelius' writing during the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. He didn't fully understand this, that he was the last of what they called the five good emperors, but he would have felt the empire slipping a little bit. He would have felt the old ways collapsing a bit. The founders turned to Stoicism. At the darkest days of Valley Forge, George Washington puts on a play about Cato called Cato. The Stoicism has always been something we've turned to, but I do think you're right. As people have turned away from the church, and also as institutions and cultural ideas have fallen away as our trust in these things have fallen away, we still have the same fundamental questions of why am I here? What does a good person do and not do? How do I find meaning? How do I find purpose? How do I deal with this grief or pain or fear or frustration or ambition that I have? Where do I direct this? And the truth is that philosophers have been answering this question or attempting to answer this question for as long as priests have been trying to help people answer these questions. And I don't see them as in conflict with each other. There is just a moment that we're in where maybe people would have gotten these ideas from their grandparents or from a pastor or from a school principal. And we don't really see that as the job of those people anymore. And so we're turning to some ancient texts to help us, again, as we always have.
Well, and this is the last point on that. The personal appeal for me is that it is empowering. Yes. I know this about myself. Like, one of the worst feelings in the world, this doesn't make me unique, but, with age comes wisdom and self-diagnosis. One of the most frustrating things for me in life is a lack of control. Professionally, career-wise, in any aspect of my life, is a lack of control. And this idea, how I react is within my control, is incredibly empowering. It also is about self-focus. I was watching a horrific television show, for what it's worth. I do not recommend it, called Eric on Netflix. But there's several times where they quote Tolstoy, and he says, everybody wants to change the world, but they never talk about changing themselves. And you have control over yourself, ultimately. And I find that empowering. And now you've written about these virtues, and I believe Right Thing Right Now would be essentially the third installment in focusing on these virtues, where you've talked about courage, you've talked about temperance, which is, we could also call that discipline, and now you're talking about justice in Right Thing Right Now. This is the hardest one, by the way, to say, I have some control over justice.
Yeah, we all despair at what's happening in the world, regardless of where you sit politically. I don't think anyone's saying, hey, it's going great right now. And this has always been true, right? And so what the Stoic definition of justice, I think it begins at home, right? It begins at home. It begins at taking responsibility for yourself. It begins in deciding, hey, I'm going to get involved. The distinction for the Stoics between Stoicism and Epicureanism, that's another word people might have heard, but sometimes have a stereotype of. Seneca, one of the great Stoics, he said, look, an Epicurean will only get involved in politics or public life if they have to. And he says a Stoic gets involved unless something prevents them. And so the idea was, hey, somebody has to do these jobs. Somebody has to make these decisions. Who should it be if not the sort of the wise and virtuous person? So Stoicism it's interesting. It's this philosophy that says, hey, you don't control what's happening in the world. Focus on yourself. But it also says, hey, now that I've sort of limited my understanding of my influence, I still do want to make a difference where I can make a difference. And that's a paradoxical thing for a lot of people, but I think it's really important.
How do you apply justice individually, though? Because we think of justice as the legal system, or maybe we think it in the hereafter. But how is justice a personal virtue?
Well, I think it starts with character. The Stoics said character is fate, right? So what are the standards that you hold yourself to? I think this is something people miss a lot about the American system, right? This is a country based on personal freedom and liberty. But the founders were very clear that just because something wasn't articulated in the Constitution or in a law passed by Congress, the Senate, or your state, didn't mean you should do it. The whole idea was that this was a system based on personal virtue. There would be a lot of freedom and a lot of latitude, but ultimately one had to take responsibility for their own decisions, their own moral character, and that a democracy could not survive without a citizenry that was steeped in the classical virtues and held themselves to a high standard of personal conduct.
So we may, here in the next 10 minutes together, explore modern-day politics to some degree. I think you and I disagree on modern-day politics, and that's perfectly fine with me. In fact, it's not more than fine. It's something that I look forward to. But help me reconcile this. One of the things that I feel like I have, and you heard me just use that word, by the way, feel like, there was a time in my life when I stopped saying that, right? I did. I said, I think, because I didn't want to lean into what I feel. And this was probably, I did a podcast yesterday with Tim Green. He's a former NFL player. He has ALS now. He's an incredible inspiration. But I think as I've gotten older, Ryan, and with humility and I think maybe some increase in wisdom, I understand we're not just logical beings. We're not just rational robots, as you mentioned earlier, that being emotional is key to being human. In fact, it could be the differentiating factor in what makes us human. And passion and emotion are such a big part of who we are, and we shouldn't run from it. How do you, like you said earlier, you said Stoicism is not roboticism, but it does seem to be removed from emotionalism and passion and feeling.
Yeah, I think it's wrong to say that the Stoics were emotionless, but they did try to be less emotional, right? But that is very different than not having the emotion. So when I feel anger at something, or I feel envy, or I feel fear, or I feel sadness, these are legitimate emotions. But I have to ask myself, is the action I'm about to take, is it going to age well when that emotion subsides? So to me, that's really the process of Stoicism. You know, Lincoln was famous. We have a bunch of letters that Lincoln wrote but never sent. He would get very angry. He was often frustrated with his generals, with other politicians, and he would write the letters and then put them in a desk drawer. They're his so-called hot letters. And to me, that's what Stoicism is. It's not being this sort of monkish person who is never provoked, never upset, who doesn't feel anything. That's probably someone who doesn't care enough. But you have to have this other side of you that goes, hey, is me venting into this email, is me calling up and yelling at this person, is me sending this tweet in a rage, is that going to serve me well in the long term? And one of the things that Marcus Aurelius talks about in the beginning of Meditations, which I think captures what we're talking about here well, he says he learned from one of his favorite teachers to be free of the passions, but full of love. And so if there is an emotion to feel, empathy, understanding, compassion, care, this is a positive emotion. And then there's some emotions that are not particularly constructive at all. This doesn't mean you stuff them down and suppress them, but you go, hey, is acting out of ego here or jealousy here, is this who I want to be as a person? And the answer is usually no.
So I think that's a great explanation of the role of emotion, and it sort of fits with what I've preached to my sons about one particular emotion, which is fear. Yeah. And I think it's apropos as we speak today on the 80th anniversary of D-Day. It would be ridiculous to presume that those men didn't feel fear. It's what they did in spite of that fear. And, you know, I from a very young age, I put my kids on skateboards, Ryan, and I want them to learn how to skateboard, not because I think it's the coolest sport in the world, but dropping in was one of the scariest things I could ever imagine into a concrete pool. And so it's a weird thing to do, to drop in on a skateboard, because fear is what will hurt you. If you conquer the fear, the actual form of and then necessity to commit is what saves you. But I would say to them, it doesn't matter what you feel. I mean, feel it. Don't feel shame for that fear. It's what you do with that fear and how you react to that fear.
Yeah, and look, if there is no fear, then there's no courage. The whole point is that courage is the triumph over that fear. If it wasn't scary, if you were convinced you were invincible, or you were delusional and not aware of the danger, then you're not acting with the virtue of courage. Courage is feeling the fear, being afraid, and doing it anyway.
So let's explore politics for just one moment.
Great.
And I don't have a question or debate to be had with you, but it just occurred to me as you were talking. Okay, even his biggest supporters, very few of Donald Trump's fans would even say, "Hey, great example of a Stoic." He's present. I think he's ever present, but he's also present, meaning whatever he's feeling, whatever he's thinking is what you get. And maybe there's a level of authenticity to that. Maybe even when he's not honest, there's a level of authenticity to that. But it occurred to me, I had the opportunity, Ryan, this past weekend to interview him, and this was 48 hours after he was convicted in New York. And clearly when you fire off an angry tweet or Truth Social post, you are leaning into the emotion of the moment, right? In which we see on a regular basis with Donald Trump. But can I be honest with you? Like, here we were 48 hours after conviction in New York. I had an hour and a half with him, and I kept searching, right? I'm like, what is the adjective I'm looking for? Is he peaceful about this? He's not angry. He doesn't seem to be vengeful. He seems to be complacent, wouldn't be the word either. It is what it is. At one point he said, yeah, one of my surrogates was saying, oh, it'd be ridiculous to send me to jail. And he said, stop, don't say that, don't beg. And maybe as I'm listening to you, I'm like, is he stoic about this entire situation right now? And I wonder if he's almost, maybe he's not reverse engineered, but immediately and obviously emotional, and then moves beyond to some kind of level of stoicism. And I know you're not a fan of Donald Trump, and maybe even for these reasons that through your analysis of stoicism, or maybe through policy or politics, or I don't know what the reason. But I did have that thought while you were talking about stoicism.
Yeah, look, there's a big difference between what we might call lowercase stoicism and uppercase stoicism. So that stiff upper lip, that ability to move on, when Bill Belichick would say on to Cincinnati or whatever, there's an element of stoicism in that for sure. And I think any great performer and politician has to have that, because it's always on to the next thing. You can't take stuff too personally. You got to face you got to be cool and collected under pressure when you're performing. So there's some of that. I think what can be missed when we look at stoicism is people want to take just the elements that might make us a bit more successful at what we do. But I think what I've been trying to do in this virtue series is remind people, and myself included, because I was a young man who was just attracted to how stoicism could make me more resilient. I want to focus on how I can use this to be a better person, a better human being. I think that's the important thing.
All right, last couple of questions. Do you see any particular politician, American politician, in your mind that embodies the virtues of stoicism?
Yeah, look, he's not a politician, but I think General James Mattis is one of my heroes, and Secretary of Defense under Trump in 2016. He's someone who would carry Marcus Aurelius with him on his deployments. He spends 40 years, sort of observing and talking about this text. So I think there are modern Stoics. Certainly, Admiral Stockdale. You're talking about a man in full. Admiral Stockdale is introduced to Epictetus and sort of uses Epictetus in the Hanoi Hilton as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. So there's been some modern Stoics to be sure. The greatest Stoics, the simplest Stoics to talk about, of course, are the ones who are no longer with us.
And yet, I actually think this is something you're doing, by the way. This is a big part of your virtue is it can't be trapped in marble and stone. It can't be something that is resigned to the ages, because for better or worse, the name Marcus Aurelius ceases to have the impact it might have had thousands of years ago. So modern day examples of application, I think, become very valuable, Ryan. And so one more on that, like you brought up Belichick. Let's go outside the world of politics. You used military, that's fine. But what about in sports? I mean, sports, I don't know if you know, I'm a huge sports fan, and it's just such a great metaphor for life and everything. And it should be a great example, or a great environment, fertile field to find great examples of stoicism.
Yeah, look, the ancient Stoics were fond of sports metaphors too. Epictetus said that we're like a ball thrower. Life throws the ball at us. We have to catch it and throw it back. It doesn't matter if it's a good throw, a bad throw, a fair throw, an unfair throw, if we like the person who threw it at us or not. We just have to catch it and throw it back. And so, yeah, I think sports are a great way to find examples in a moment of a specific attribute of Stoicism. And I try to do that in my books. I tell a story in the new book about Frank Robinson. He hits what he thinks is going to be a home run. It comes up short. It bounces off the back wall. And because he didn't run out the ball, he ends up having to settle for a single instead of a double or a triple. And after the game, he walks into the manager's office and he throws down like a $200 fine. Now, the team had won in a landslide, and he's a multi-time MVP. Nobody cared. But he said, I'm fining myself. He's like, I didn't do my best. And so when we have moments like that, we go, oh, okay, this is what I want to apply in my day-to-day life. How do I hold myself accountable? How am I responsible? And I think that's ultimately what Stoicism is about. So I love just little examples that bring these timeless ideas into the present moment.
Well, he's focused on justice, the third in an installment of a series that focuses on the four virtues of Stoicism. He's written about courage, the obstacle is the way. He's written about discipline. He's now writing about justice, and the title of the book is Right Thing, Right Now, Good Values, Good Character, Good Deeds. You should go pick it up. I endorse what Ryan's putting out there. I think this is a great philosophy of virtue, and it's not only not a problem. I think it's It's a benefit. It's a feature, not a bug, that we don't agree on everything. And I'm a fan, man. I'm a fan of what you're doing, and I think everybody should check out Right Thing right now. Appreciate you, Ryan.
Appreciate it. Thank you.